Welcome everyone to today's lecture for the Philippine Social Science Seminar Series, or PhilS4 webinar, which is sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the University of the Philippines, Diliman, SOAS in London, and Humboldt University of Berlin, which is hosting today's lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Allan Punzalan Isaac, who is Professor of American Studies and English and Associate of American Studies and English and Associate Dean of Humanities at Rutgers University-New Brunswick in New Jersey. He is also co-director of the Rutgers Global Asians Collaborative. He specializes in Asian American and comparative race studies and examines issues around migration, post-coloniality, gender and sexuality in the Philippines and its diaspora. His first book, American Tropics, Articulating Filipino America, was a recipient of the Association for Asian American Studies Cultural Studies Book Award. And his second book is entitled Filipino Time, Affective Worlds and Contracted Labor, from which his talk for today, the same title, is drawn. He has taught at De La Salle University, Taft in Manila, and in Philippines as a senior Fulbright scholar. So welcome, Professor Isaac, to today's webinar. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rosa Cordillera Castillo. I'm teaching at the Institute for Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin. And I'm welcoming people, I guess, from various parts of the world, 11 p.m. in Sydney, I think 8 p.m. in Manila, 7 a.m. in New York, and 1 p.m. here in Berlin. So thank you very much, Professor Isaac, for making the time at such an early hour to share with us your work today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosa Castillo. Thank you also to Yona Pomeranz, Danny, I know who's in the technical background, also to Humboldt University for sponsoring the Philippine Social Science series, and thank you to that network, SOAS, UP Diliman, Sydney Southeast Asia Center, of course, and everyone who's joining us in different parts of the world at different time zones in Europe, Asia, and North America. And this is actually quite appropriate given the talk that I'm presenting to you today. And I dedicate our time together to Dr. Bien Lumbera, who passed away this past September. And he has informed my work, this work in particular, and also many others. Hopefully it will show in the excerpts that I'll be reading from around Datíng, and also in the idea of mourning and grieving. So Filipino time is a familiar concept to many of us. It's the condition of interminable delay, deferral, lateness. It is also sometimes a power move and a set of decisions calculated to counter what some might suspect is a power move. So some people lie to another person who's a continual offender and then basically give them a different time, and then they know they're being lied to, and so in the end everything is all a jumble. But usually Filipino time is a judgment made by Filipinos against other Filipinos. Filipinos and other colonized people, and so it's not unusual to Filipinos this idea of X time, and other colonized peoples understand this texture of everyday rhythms, temporal coordination, alignments, and accidents. It is not just a temporality, it is a communal and affective understanding, a social concept. A colleague at Rutgers University here in Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies, Brittany Cooper, has a TED Talk, you can look her up actually, on what is familiar humor and concept for many Black people in the US, something called CP time or Black people time. She talks through how time is racialized, given the racialized history of who owns labor, who owns bodies, who owns time, who owns the commodities resulting from racialized labor time. Filipino time, I propose, nuances this even further. So when I explained the title to my brilliant and queer editor, Richard Morrison, he acknowledged it quite readily. Oh yes, of course, it's like drag queen time. So indeed, Filipino time speaks to non-normative, queer, racialized, and in our case, and this event even, globalized and contracted time. This event, and this is the cover of the book, this event is not unusual, nor is it theoretical. It is the everyday that many Filipino diasporics live. Many in our families, or even ourselves, work abroad as caregivers, teachers, nurses, domestics, and perhaps back home as call center agents. These jobs, that is to say, we, are the vital links to capital flows. These affective laborers, these vital links, are the subjects and sites of Filipino time. Filipino time, affective worlds, and contracted labor ask, how do we give account of and trace Filipino diasporic subjectivity across multiple spaces and times at once? Referring back to the notion of time as racialized, we would have to rethink labor time in these terms and consider how a productivity-centered relationship to time has a colonial history. Right? And therefore time, this conception of time itself, is colonized, including labor time. So when we think about and rethink as a thought exercise, the notion of labor theory of value, it has been further complicated by feminists and Italian Marxists, given the character of affective labor itself. Service labor or speculative labor reintroduces the multiple capacities of the body and senses at the center of such labor. So we actually understand sort of like these capacities. These are human capacities that are required of active labor. And we also then witness the body going through time itself in order to produce this service, whether it's about a call center, and this is from the business processing organization in the Philippines about call center work or outsourcing work, not just call centers, but other outsourcing BPO work. Work abroad, live here was one of their mottos. So, given the fact that speculative capital, which is service labor, reintroduces the multiple capacities of the body and the senses, right? We actually have to rethink what makes socially necessary. This notion of labor time, what is socially necessary? Is it race? Is it geography? Is it gender? All right, is it class that creates value to produce such capital service or to be in service of capital? Right? Time then in speculative capital gets complicated still since it refers to value making that comes from the past, one's education, one's geography, one's birth place, etc. But also the future, because of course you import service labor for their future labor that they will do to you. All right, because they're not themselves supposed to be. They're not supposed to be the commodities, but they are traded as such. So I'm just going through this thought process to really complicate this notion of what labor time is, given the particulars of affective work. And what are the uncaptured elements of labor time when it comes to affective labor? Care work is not repetitive, mechanical, skilled labor housed in a factory. Other and more human capacities, especially the capacity to dream, connect, improvise, are called upon to do care work effectively. Rather than the impoverishment of the senses and the desensitization of the worker into passivity, as Marx suggested, sensitivity and the capacity to anticipate, and to anticipate desire, is cultivated. While work time has been purchased, traded, contracted for the activity to take place, the qualitative texture of time, its chronicity, shared with others, is in the realm of action, creativity, and meaning-making of the subject. I draw attention here to the affective worlds that is the desired product of service work that could provide insight into other human capacities wielded within, but also beyond state and economic constraints. Visual, oral, haptic, kinesthetic, and other sensorial registers mark and shape the temporal dimensions of human labor. However, affective labor is designed to be erased. We don't see who makes the world run, right? We certainly see who runs the world, but not those who make the world run. By design, capitalism is supposed to be seamless, and the seamlessness is made possible only through relationality and groupment that is actually as a result of these affective labor. Therefore, these spaces, these affective worlds, are within contracted time. So I just want to go through a little bit before I read from the excerpts from a couple of chapters. These are the sort of sites of affective worlds that I'm talking about. So I first introduced the idea of what it means to accumulate time, we can reconceive time, just as an example of the sort of viral video that happened when Venus Raw placed in the top 15, and the way that it was a perpetual motion machine in which the virtual world became sort of this affective world that actually communicated to the diaspora itself, especially with these young men at the center. Not necessarily Venus, but she was the catalyst, but in fact, the young man themselves. And actually then we can imagine a global present in the virtual world through technology. And in the first chapter I examine, and I'll read from there, is Datíng and Ramona Diaz's learning, and this is about teachers, Filipino teachers in Baltimore, Maryland, and they teach in predominantly Black and Latino schools. And I look at in the next chapter, I also look at the short stories by Mia Alvar, Michelle Skinner, Nathan Go, and these are set in Bahrain, Italy, in sort of a mythical present-day Philippines. And looking at these short stories and for these notions of immobility, right? We think of Filipinos circulating, but the short stories themselves are quite about stasis and immobility. But I read that as sort of an in-betweenness that actually allows each story's protagonist to highlight other ways of living, whether it's about anticipation or speculation or future telling. And speaking of futures, I'm actually in the next chapter, I talk about the call centers as a distinct temporal and global space in the Philippines, and the fact that it's an affective sphere in which national subjects working something called offshore. Let's take it literally. What is the offshore as a temporal and global space that negotiates uneven futures for people, but also causes disruptions to daily and communal life? And finally, in the fourth chapter, I actually look at caregivers in Israel. I had spent some time in Israel as well, interviewing caregivers there. But in particular, I'm looking at the Care Divas, the musical that was produced in the Philippines, to actually rethink this notion of palabas and how we can understand it as a sociality. Right? And Tagalog concept words become really important in the book to actually frame these affective worlds. And finally, in the Coda, I look at a type I look at iborol, which is of course, remote grieving when you project into, or at least open the camera to a family member or a friend who had passed away in the Philippines, and this has really been much more common now in the US, but it has been a mainstay of, I think, Filipino diasporic lives for the last 10, 12 years or so. So these sites together provide a palimpsest of how Filipino subjectivities circulate transnationally and are constantly in a process of becoming. And as Manalansan had observed, temporality is both the context and product of globalized labor. So I ask, how does capitalist power work away from economistic quantitative models? So various disruptions, deployments, and senses of time rub up alongside, even make way in between historical, chronological ideas of time in the lived experience of migratory labor. So let me just read from an excerpt from one of the chapters in Datíng about this notion of what is Datíng, right? In informal conversation, when someone is noticed for her bearing in a social setting, she is said to have or possess Datíng. Datíng describes the force or impression a person or object brings by appearing in the world. Philippine writer-critic Bienvenido Lumbera defines it as ang impresyong iniiwan sa isang tao na pagmumukha, bihis, pananalita at kilos ng isang individual. The impression left by a person's looks, dress, address, and movement. Later, Lumbera applies this definition to Philippine literary works to name the effect of artistic objects that place individual and audience in relationship to each other. Lumbera describes Datíng as the movement of artistic qualities to the consciousness of the observer or listener. Datíng is aesthetics, as literary critic David Bayot explains in his reading of Lumbera. Quote, the word has the denotation and connotation of both appeal and impact, end quote. In this movement from object to audience, Lumbera deploys the metaphor of the haptic in speaking about impressions left on the observer's consciousness, Thus, dating is a type of affect. Ascribed to persons, dating is not necessarily about being conventionally beautiful, but having social potency, which the English word attractive in part suggests. However, rather than a centripetal force, that is to say, seeking the center, like attraction, dating issues from the body to a specific locale in its circulation within it. Dating names how a body or objects exude centrifugal, that is to say, away from the center, negative or positive, to generate feeling in a locale. When Filipinos translate dating into its more conventional root meaning as arrival, both social bearing and point of entry merge. Therefore, one can say in Taglish that if one has dating, one possesses arrival. And we've heard this, I may arrive. Right? Dating as a way of appearing in the world is a mode of arrival. A person's dating, or appeal and impact to use Bayot's phrase, creates conditions for sociality. Dating is a form of address that generates and defines the term of collectivity at the same time that it generates pleasure. A person might be unaware of her dating, but she is admired usually by way of a group acknowledgement. So individuals might be bonded through admiration of the person as achieved state, creating a temporary sociality. Ay, may dating siya. And of course, dating is usually characterized, is used to describe male figures, but I'm actually trying to invert that and shifting that towards female characters and figures. So anthropologist Fenella Canal has described how local beauty pageants in lowland Christian Philippine cultural practices are a form of communal power, not only in the act of holding the crowd's attention, but also in making a social network manifest and visible through audience acclamation. So beauty, using the vernacular spelling B-I-U-I-T-I, defines personhood, as Manalansan has argued, evoking its queer sensibilities. Relatedly, bakla, Manalansan signals, quote, is not an identity, but more accurately a slippery condition, a performative event or series of events of self-formation, end quote. Self-formation, according to social scripts and setting, is tactical, I would argue. Thus, beauty as personhood beyond personal appearance comes to light only in communality. Further, I would argue that a person's dating is a tactical and tactile, just to say, to refer back to Lumbera's idea of the haptic, is a tactile redirection of space and time. I'm going to see if this actually just very 2 seconds.
Philippines! But because I think
and that was just a brief thing from the learning when one of the characters shows what is, in fact, her dream. And then it's not in the United States, it's not in the Philippines, it's in this mythical capitalist space of Disneyland, right? And of course, that's Catriona Gray doing the lava walk, which of course captured everyone's imagination. It's like, wait, did I just sort of like, fast forward and slow down when people were saying the clip? And just the different sort of like notions of the thing. The thing generates value in atmosphere and events as ends in themselves. Let us recall Lumbera's description of arrival as event. This is a translation. At the experience of this arrival, the impact or arrival of the work, the audience reacts with laughter, joy, or admiration, end quote. Arrival, therefore, is an experience in itself. It is a disruptive event that marks possibility. I would thus connect arrival to futurity in the fullness of present possibility. If return is framed as an iteration of arrival, the past as a discrete temporal comparison recedes, because we usually think of return as somehow going back in time or going back to a place. But what if we actually think of return as another type of arrival, another type of dating? And that's what I was looking at in the documentary by Ramona Diaz. Arrival is a disruption of the present, so that another vision of the future emerges. Time here is not about chronology on which return depends, a sequence of events that could be recalled or be made discrete. In other words, the thing is not so much about time as duration, but about timing and the opportune. That is to say, in rhetorical terms, kairos, not chronos. That intangible eventuality, not wholly about individual intention, but the deployment of social conditions to configure possibility. If the thing is about bending time and space of the present, someone's presence becomes a moment of other possibilities that were not there before her arrival. What emerges in arrival understood in this way is the immaterial forces that circulate to create the terms of the local community and its legibility to itself. Together, arrival and impact may be understood through this emergence. So thinking through Datíng, I suggest that Datíng as affect could describe the interruptive spaces and times within global migration by which overseas Filipinos craft their own departures, returns, and arrivals. So allow me to read from the Coda, from the conclusion of the book. Because it has been many people have suffered loss in the last 2 years, not just loss in a sense of not seeing our families, but also real loss in a sense that the inability to attend to very important rituals in our lives for people passing back home or elsewhere, and the fact that we have to do it remotely. But this practice, of course, mediated mourning practice, iborol, is offered by St. Peter Chapels in the Philippines to allow overseas Filipinos to attend funerals from overseas. I look at this mediated mourning practice common in and made necessary by Filipino diasporic life even before the pandemic to explore various embodied conceptions of sociality and relationality when time and space do not coincide but are juxtaposed through a mediated interface. Iborol as a service is a technological affordance that sutures the disruptions in Filipino lives wrought by nation-state laws and borders, as well as economic imperatives for migration from global south to north. Across the globe, Skype, Facebook, FaceTime, Viber, WhatsApp, and other interface services are normalized options to maintain contact with loved ones from middle and working class families who depend on remittance income. Filipino families use these communications media to meet status obligations and maintain personal ties. Since the medium affords entry and exit into various modes of time, ritual time, everyday time, and times even, iborol makes manifest various ways of being with others. I highlight 2 Tagalog concept words here that map other ways to generate ecologies of communality. The first, Pakiramdam, literally to make oneself felt or to feel a presence, is affective engagement without immediate proximity at all. The feeling can as easily refer to an engagement with spirits and non-human entities, and even with ideas, abstractions, and situations. The second, Kapiling, which I will focus more on here, with the collectivizing ka prefix, is to be in someone's proximity or vicinity, but does not necessarily include or demand any interaction between 2 parties. One can be in the same room, for example, without necessarily engaging with the other or communicating as a point of contact, like, for this example, this webinar. Right? One can be, this relationality registers how a person's proximity generates connectivity without direct interaction. Both Pakiramdam and Kapiling recognize that 2 or more parties who might have a passing or previous histories are engaged in generating a shared but fluid relationship. Iborol, or live stream vigils, and you can see an example here, and you can see that there are different rooms at the bottom of the screen here of the slide. This is St. Peter Chapel in Bacolod, which is and this has the large viewing room that I've set here, and the camera is set in this particular way as if you were in one of the seats or couches. Iborol is not simply a digital reincorporation of the family in real time, though that is an effect given the cultural force of the category family. However, the various modes of mourning also reveal, I would underscore, other notions of being with others in shared communality. Technology expands the present through these spatial juxtapositions. Therefore, it makes possible the modulation of being present with and to others, visual, physical, and virtual, to name a few. Digital mourning as a form of communing generates an atmosphere that transforms here and there into a shared interval with others and acknowledges the multiple rhythms that comprise the present for each subject. Thus, this imperfect medium registers how living labor in the face of death enables various ways to be present amid incommensurable strands and rhythms of different lives at once. Grieving is a relational act. The act of grieving alone or with others makes palpable the vulnerable sites that selves keep at bay to preserve our notions of individuality. To gather at this moment of vulnerability is testament to the deceased having lived with and through others. To be sure, the social ecology is riven with conflicts, inequity, ambivalence, and violence that bring subjects and technological platforms together. The technology, power asymmetries, and capital flows all constitute the very environment by which individuals, that is to say, not separate individuals, but bodily beings implicated in others, constitute communalities through various self-presentations. So let me actually share a little bit of the interview and ethnography that I was doing. The week-long vigil in the Philippines as a 24-hour activity often involves family members taking 8-hour shifts for the duration, since the deceased bodies must always be accompanied by loved ones until transport to its final physical and spiritual resting place. An important aspect of Iborol is not just the opportunities to connect with family, but rather the times when there is no interaction between the two juxtaposed spaces. Everyday work happens in one place, while ritual time happens on screen. Over the week, my informant George was content to see the funereal world only occasionally. Quote, I would leave the camera on as they went about greeting guests or arranging things. Over here, I was making dinner, doing laundry, eating, watching. If I were there physically, time would stop. This way, my everyday still goes on, end quote. So my informant can be around without engaging fully. This way, he could manage entry into and out of ritual time and into everyday time. All the while, the family and loss would be physically evident as a computer screen on the office or on a kitchen table. By being present when nothing particularly was happening in the physical viewing room or between him and the room, the virtual proximity or kapiling without the burden of family or social expectations gave comfort and the space to manage personal grief alone while being with others. Being physically present would require stopping to observe ritual duties like greeting guests, etc., etc. This practice in Kapiling acknowledges the loss and its attendant rituals without engaging fully or being fully lost in as a feeling. The practice has larger implications. Mourning is difficult, so are families. To be with but not engage fully in physical and emotional ways through this technology also means not having to engage with larger social structures, not just family, but also state, economic forces, and the law. For queer subjects, for migrants both documented and undocumented, for those in various economic and legal precarities, these larger structures can pose challenges. In one sense, to stop time is to be undone not just by the mourning itself, but by the structural and material demands of mourning. The person might not be allowed to return to work or to the host country if they were to leave. Crossing the border might be the subject's undoing, given legal and economic limitations. For a queer subject, putting on heteronormative face for the family might also undo the world any migrant subject has been able to create elsewhere. Any action or feeling apart from the group or that departs from social expectations becomes impossible. To be undone by grief and mourning can be personal as well as material and structural, family, social, legal, economic disciplines. Iborol is a presence and affect that provides a qualitative recompense to qualitative communal demands of shame, debt of obligation, and consolation. These socio-disciplinary demands all mark a lack in the social ecology that requires acts of recovery. But as qualitative and relational terms, they also index the impossibility of recoverability itself. No amount of remittance of goods or funds in the economic sense can make up for the shortfall, especially one precipitated by death. Butler reminds us that the only real grief worth its name is that which has no recompense or consolation. The decedent can never be replaced after all. No amount of consolation can truly console. Nothing, not even physical presence, will ever be enough. While one might rightly understand long-distance grieving as an effect of capitalism's violence, what I read alongside this fact is the possibility of relating differently to loss, as well as to family and other communal structures. People might be in-grouped differently in more layered, loose, or tactical ways, not just in the conventional ways of being together. So to wrap up, Kapiling and Pakiramdam as types of feelings that modulate being with others are not necessarily unique to Filipino culture. but the words encapsulate in everyday parlance the variety of ways to generate fellow feeling, communality, and witness without subjects having to occupy time and space in alignment at once, which is a condition of the later diasporas. The technological affordances disperses social norms towards different modes of affective rather than economic exchange. To gather duration and imagination signals vitality and affective exchange alongside but also beyond capitalist intention and national borders to achieve legibility to one another even in this articulation. In the bending, disruption, and frictions in time, these life-making activities through other modes of exchange and accumulation without profit manifest in these affective communal worlds, which are these momentary but palpable gatherings of the imagination. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Isaac, for this brilliant talk from your book. And I hope that those who are listening and watching our event today will go and buy this book. How brilliantly wove together, questions of time and affect and distance in context of capitalism, racialization, colonial legacies, export labor migration, even digital technology, but then shifting the gaze away just from an economic reading of this and towards alternative and more creative and affective ways of living together and of persisting. So I would like to invite our audience to put your questions or your comments in the chat, and I will share them to everyone. I will read them out for Professor Isaac and for everyone to hear. So please go ahead and feel welcome to share your comments and your questions. But I'll go ahead and start, Professor Isaac, with your work. So in this sharing, you derive a lot from Tagalog concepts of such as Datíng, Kapiling, and Pakiramdam, and I wonder whether you're looking also or have looked at other Philippine languages that relate to this phenomenon that you're looking at. I mean, I'm looking at this slide and it is in Bacolod, which is Ilonggo speaking, so it's a different language. So I wonder how language plays a role in this, in your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, my control of the Philippine language is mainly Tagalog, so I don't have control of the other 60 linguistic areas that we have. But I think it's important to actually look at, and I think obviously there's a school of thought that sees language as worldviews, right? And it becomes really important to interrogate sort of like the assumptions and the worlds that are created by these concept words. Because then what is the larger project is to make sure that the Western notions of, let's say, performance or community, let's say, these are sort of the translations, right? Performance, community, or togetherness is actually not universal. That's the larger project, which I think is very important for people. So in order to be particular, then we can actually complicate the universal and actually then provincialize sort of, I think, these Western concepts that we use theoretically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that and for pointing out, of course, the relationship between language and worldview. If there is nothing yet, here's a comment from J. Paul Manzanilla. So related to this conceptualization of Kapiling are pakikidalamhati, or nakikidalamhati, and pakikisama, where spatial, emotional, and affective distances are also being bridged and even erased. So thank you for that comment. What would you like to respond to this, Professor Isaac?
No, again, so the way and I've spoken to other folks when I've delivered versions of the talk before the book, and that the way that we've come up with different ways of engroupment. And the larger question is really engroupment in different ways, not just sort of physical or even imagined communities, right? And the way that Benedict Anderson said, and that's one of the sort of rethinking that I was doing. It's not just sort of like nationalism can't be the only way we understand ourselves as a group. And I also don't even mean also within our regional or ethno-linguistic communities. But rather engroupment is, there are different ways that are erased or subordinated, right? In the way we understand ourselves, not just in these very Western categories of nation or even region for that matter, but ways that are active, right? And all of these things, pakikisama, right? And are emotional. They actually demand labor. It's important that they are productive. And the product itself is engroupment. And I use that word engroupment or borrow that term so that just to avoid this notion of community, because it becomes very trite and stilted and already and has already been colonized as a concept. And I think it's important totally to look at these sort of localized concept words to then limb out other ways of being that are affective, emotional, and productive in different ways, right?
Thank you so much for this response, and also, of course, for the comment. And there's another question from Mega Amrith. So she writes, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I'm sorry that I missed parts of it, so apologies if you already addressed this. Related to the question on language and worldview, how do these concepts move and transform in hybrid global contexts? For instance, in the very diverse communities that labor migrants from the Philippines move in.
Right. So it's not as if the concept words are the ones that are circulating, but I'm using the concept words to describe, in fact, the what is happening in these other ways of people in grouping. Right? So it's not the concept words themselves that are circulating. It's not the words, but rather it's a way to describe what is happening when we're talking about sort of these four young men in, in a reaction video creating this other type of community that's not nationalist, that's not, that is across not just the labor diaspora, but also in Latin America, who are also as crazy about Miss Universe as some Filipinos, right? So these are, so I'm just using them as descriptors. Again, not relying on Western concepts, I think, so that I can mine them not only the Tagalog concept, but also to do away with the Western sort of universalizing attempt to define what is happening in labor diaspora. So indeed, you're absolutely right. I think that they're very diverse communities, but I'm using them, these concept words really so as not to fall into sort of community, nation, workers as categories that really have been predefined already, but that there are other ways people go beyond these identities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Just a quick note, Professor Isaac, I think there's a beeping sound.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Let me just take care of that 1 second.
All right. So for everybody who have further questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And as soon as Professor Isaac is back, I will read them out. Okay, so now you're okay. Good. Right. So that
digital technologies.
I mean, I was thinking of what you're talking about with Iburol and how people can participate, Kapiling and Pakiramdam with relatives back home, and at the same time focus on other things. Sort of, not being fully. It's almost like being on Zoom.
Exactly.
All the Zoom events that we're having at the moment. I mean, of course, not in the context of mourning, but I mean in the context of like dividing one's attention and different tasks and what that does affectively in terms of being with the other is so much, I think, has changed so much with the pandemic and the and how normalized Zoom has become. So I'd like to read the question from Ferdinand Lopez. So congratulations, Allan, for a wonderful talk. I love the concept of Pakiramdam, earlier explored by Virgilio Enriquez in his works on Kapwa, and your own brilliant deployment of the term in articulation with Filipino time. How does paramdam, often associated with visitation, bring together the concept of dating, arrival, kapiling, togetherness, bend, stretch, and extend time, protracting the relations in space and time among and between the living and the dead?
Thank you so much, Ferdy, for that question. And you're absolutely right. The notion is that when someone passes away, and I just want to, as a side point, I used sort of the funereal iburol to actually talk about different types of presences, right, and different ways of being with each other. But really, you're absolutely right, Rosa, in the fact that Zoom and the pandemic has made that a reality for more people, right? Having to be with someone or to be with others in these multiple rhythmic ways. So back to Ferdy's question, when someone passes away, there is an anticipation, it is a hope that someone will make themselves felt, right? And I think this is sort of like, and they usually come at an opportune time. And what is the kairotic? But precisely the intervention into the chronological by the divine, right? That is to say, or the non sort of like material world intruding into the immaterial world, intruding into the material world to disrupt time itself. So absolutely, to actually have a presence felt by someone who might have passed away, or even passed away a long time ago, or even someone who you did not know, but a presence has been felt, means that time can be mythic time, divine time, always intrudes upon historical time. And that's an interesting way to live, right? That is to say, that is part of the consciousness of human consciousness, right? That it's always about, it's about this breaking of divine into the historical. And that speaks to the kairotic, right? And rather than the chronological. So thank you for that question. So you're absolutely right. I mean, they do come together, right? Even Datíng is kairotic, right? It's a way by which your arrival interrupts what is going on. The unfolding of an event is now interrupted by someone coming in. And it's like, I made the thing. And it really is this moment that actually the present now becomes full of possibilities, right? And these are sort of qualitative ways to experience time and not just sort of like productivity or even historical unfolding. Right? So that's so you're absolutely right, Ferdy, to point to the way that it actually becomes really all tied together, especially when we're talking about the interruptions of the chronos by kairos. Thank you.
Thank you also for your response. So there's a question two questions from Christine Balance. So thanks so much, Professor Isaac, for your wonderful talk and book overview. Two simple questions. So first is, what does the turn toward artistic or cultural performances and objects do for your book's thesis? And the second question is, can you tell us more about the evocative image of Aliens of Manila by the work by Leroy New that serves as your book's cover?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. Let me
maybe show the slide again.
Yeah, I'll go to the slide because obviously I am doing multiple things at once. There it is. Does everyone see that slide now? Okay,
yes.
Great. So I think the aesthetic, the turn to the aesthetic, whether it's about the artistic or the cultural performances, because these are points of vitality, right? When we're talking about vitalism, vitality, aliveness, what is alive, all right? What is alive even within, especially in affective labor, within contracted time, these are worlds that are created. These are uncaptured engroupments, vitalities that cannot be captured or quantified by capital relations. Right? Because capital, I mean, this is Masumi and other Italian and feminists and some Italian Marxists really have been trying to talk about that, yes, capitalism is all encompassing but not all consuming. it does not and cannot capture everything. And affective labor is a particular site, right? Just like that actually still involves aesthetics. To relate to someone, to make time for someone, even though your time has been bought, contracted, you still have to make that time. There is a creative aspect to the labor. And so I'm also looking at cultural expressions that talk about, that use the subject of service laborers, caregivers, et cetera, and actually look at the way aesthetics, the cultural expression captures this vitality and really does away or complicate our economistic analysis of how lives are lived. So that's the answer to the first question. And first of all, I love Leroy New's work, right? I think he's just fantastic. And you've seen his work. Ano yan?
I love his work too.
Yeah, totally. No. He's like, for those of you who don't know, he's a young, quite prominent artist based in the Philippines. His mother lives here in New York, and he's actually a full artist. That's to say, gesamte Kunstwerk. I mean, the way that he uses theater, uses production design, uses design, sculpture, et cetera, and actually crafts work from all these elements of waste, for example. So a lot of it is a recycled inorganic things and then incorporating them into organic figures, like the one that you see on the cover. And this is part of a series called Aliens of Manila. And this is one of them, and the others are someone shopping in a mall, but then wearing a plastic bucket on their heads or doing these sort of like futuristic things. So number one, he's playing with time and also the notion of value, right? Time and value is really interesting because these are now valueless or invaluable objects. They've been cast aside, their use is no more, but yet, of course, he recreates them into these sort of like very organic and inorganic hybrids, right? So the fact that something is past, but then what he creates is a certain futurity. And even in an interview, he says that he was very fascinated as a young man, with science fiction, to see Filipinos in the future, right? And actually project them into the future. And he's actually projecting Filipinos into this sort of futuristic models through this sort of discarded past objects, which is fascinating. And with this particular figure, I really love it because whether number one, recalls sort of a siren's, the siren sort of calling to the ship. You see the ship in the background moving, but yet the figure, she, are in a precarious position, which is really interesting because you can't see their eyes, right? But yet they seem to have other sensorial or sensory attachments to them, but they're multiple. There are multiple ways of sensing the world, but yet they're not all powerful, right? The figure itself. The figure is not all powerful because they seem to be trying a balancing act, right? And so Aliens of Manila, I think the series by Leroy New, is really about the ways by which this sort of dystopic world where people are born to actually be elsewhere, to be sent elsewhere. And it's not too dystopic because that is the reality for many Filipino families, right? Where one child is usually chosen to be sent abroad to make life better for the family, as we see with Angel in the documentary and even our own personal examples. And I think it's an interesting way by which this figure becomes sort of either a sacrificial figure, a precarious figure, and even a divine figure within sort of like a tempestuous world. So I think there's a lot of texture in his work and the way to read it as well. So those are just some of the things that evoked for me this particular image, but also I think generally the body of work of Leroy New in general.
Okay, thanks. So we have two more questions, and then we will wrap up the webinar. So from Joseph Juan to Ramirez. Hi, Allan. Thanks for an amazing presentation. I'm looking also at the concept of death and lamay as a form of grieving. How do you see the lamay as also a form of departure or celebration prior to departure? the vigil or rosary as currency that allows the soul to, quote unquote, arrive at its place, and how death is used to also imagine a potential space or place that the soul can travel to.
Right.
From Jojo.
And it's really interesting because you're using Jojo. Thank you for the question. And what your question evokes is the notion of journey, right? You say travel, you say journey, sumakabila, right? In the passing over. And these are also within sort of our vocabulary of imagination. And what is important to me, again, is to repeat, it's not an imagined community, but a community of imagination, right? And these are concept words that you also bring in, the lamay and also the journey into the next stage, is that we must attend to them, right? Because it's part of the way that the everyday and that social cohesion can continue, right? Is that we must attend to people passing over, right? Passing into other realms that we don't quite understand, but we will help them get there. But we can only understand so much. And that, I think, is very important because it is, we'll call it the divine, but at least it is the immaterial, it is the otherworldly that intervenes in our everyday time. And that's what ritual is, right? Ritual is precisely the way we come to mark, lives, durations, but also a way that we understand them to always be temporary, right? That it is always a continuing and ever-changing journey, a sense of becoming. And that we would only be privileged to attend to someone's journey. To the next. Sorry, but at any rate, it's a really important sort of emotional tool, but it's also a social tool for us.
You want to take a moment?
All good.
Good. Thank you so much again for this, just really expanding also how we're thinking about these concepts and practices that we're so used to. For those of us who are from the Philippines, and of course, given also in the light of all the losses many people have had the past 2 years. So the last question, if it's still okay with you, Professor Isaac? Okay. So question from Professor Lucy Burns. Professor Isaac, how might we understand your deployment of pakikisama and kapiling and dating in relationship to the theories of Ray Ileto, Bian Lumbera, and others as a subaltern epistemology of the Philippines?
Right. And what I keep going back to the funereal scene, right? That what's interesting about the camera, let me just go to that. The funereal camera is that unlike the Foucauldian surveillance that we're talking about the camera and the gaze and the optic gaze, the Foucauldian sort of gaze is really about highlighting the thing that needs to be excluded, right? Whereas here, what's interesting is what is being highlighted is the subaltern in a sense. That is to say, that which is marginalized in the world. The global south comes into your living room because you are part of that global south, all right? The Philippines in particular. You're also you're also witnessing, and to go back to Jojo's idea, the privilege of attending to someone's journey. And that is, again, not valued. It's not about productivity, right? It's not about a laboring body. It's not speculative capital because there's no future, right? Speculative capital, it is about your future labor and the service you can provide. But what's being highlighted by this particular camera is in fact the end of life, your end of productivity. You no longer have the potential to labor, but yet you also witness in this very attention or being with others, the life, the ecology of the community, right? The social ecology. So you're absolutely right, I think, that it actually highlights, when we start to refocus, right, on the things that are, and also refocus also in the boundaries, all right, between the interface, which is usually not seen, right? The interface, the thing that makes things seamless, is now being seen, right? because those things that are supposed to be, that make things seamless, are not valued. But here they are given a life, right? And then, of course, in investigating and interrogating those seams and these spaces that are already disposable, right, and devalued, I think then we actually get to see things that are uncaptured by capital. And this is where vitality lies. And this is where imagination and creativity also lie. And where the divine intrudes, or the immaterial and the divine intrudes into our everyday. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great note to end the webinar. So I'd like to thank everyone for your very engaging comments and questions. I'd like to thank, of course, Danny and Yona, who are assisting from Berlin, from Humboldt University of Berlin, and also the co-organizers of this webinar, Philippine Social Science Seminar Series. And of course, Professor Isaac, for your very engaging sharing of your brilliant work. There's really lots to think about and lots to explore, and also in our own experiences with what you have provided with us conceptually, as well as empirically in the questions that you're raising in your talk. And so thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And yeah, and I bid you all goodbye, and I hope you're all will all be well. Yeah, stay safe and healthy. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.